Hey, Riff Nation, thanks for tuning in today. We're excited. We're going to dive into a conversation that Preston Ulmer, our spiritual formations pastor, he had with the boys from BEMA. Yes, the boys from BEMA, Marty, Solomon, and crew. You might be familiar with BEMA from when Marty was a guest recently. Preston sits down. He has a conversation with them on their podcast. They've allowed us to share with you about the Doubters Club. I think it'll be helpful. And so let's dive in.
This is the BEMA Podcast with Marty Solomon. I'm his co-host, Brent Billings. Today, we're joined by Preston Ulmer, author of Deconstruct Faith, Discover Jesus, founder and director of the Doubters Club, pastor at North Point Church in Springfield, Missouri, and many pastoral roles before that. Preston, welcome to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
And I don't know if you and Marty want to talk a little bit about how you got together. And I'd also love to hear some more details about who you are, what your family is like, your hobbies, whatever you want to add to my introduction that would kind of give people a picture of who you are.
I'll jump in. I mean, I first met Marty by way of him endorsing my book. I had a short list of people that I'm like, it would be awesome if I could have an endorsement from one of these minds. And Marty was on that short list. And ever since then, I think I've just bothered him on social media enough for him to invite me on his podcast.
Well, it was, the team has done a pretty good job of sending. They told me, they're like, we're not just going to send you every single book that is a part of our publishing house. We're going to try to pick the ones that we feel like are kind of in your vein and in your alley, and we'll send those to you. And your book came through, and it was a great choice. I was glad they sent it. I thought it was a really helpful resource, and I'm excited to talk about it more today. But one of the things that you do, Preston, is you have this thing called the Doubters Club, which, by the way, I love just by the name alone, but I know very little about. Can you tell us more about the Doubters Club, what it is, what you do, what your passions in your heart? Just give us the long like a 40-floor elevator pitch. Like, give us the long version.
Well, I'm scared of heights. No, I'm not. I'm just kidding. But yes, I'll tell you. The Doubters Club. So this is what we do. We've launched over 100 Doubters Clubs around the world. They never take place in churches. They're not ministries. They're actually clubs. They're co-moderated by a Jesus follower and someone who doesn't follow Jesus that are actually friends. And the whole goal, Marty, is model friendship and pursue truth and goodness together. That's the whole goal. And Christians aren't known to be able to throw gatherings without ulterior motives. So we have to constantly, tell people and show people this is really what we're about. So we have Doubters Clubs in coffee shops, bars, pubs, pottery places, parties, burger joints, neighborhoods. And we started it, about 6 years ago in Denver, Colorado. And honestly, if you're going to ask me like, hey, what are you most passionate about? Training people to live Doubters Club as a lifestyle to help bridge that gap in families. As I travel and speak, I hear about the divide more and more from people who inherited a faith that they don't believe in anymore, and to help people launch Doubters Club. So it is fascinating. It's not a debate. There's a lot of levity to those rooms. But the group, you'd find this interesting, Marty, the group actually votes on what they want to talk about the next time they meet. So they meet once a month, and it's always co-moderated by two people who don't agree with each other but are dear friends.
Yeah. So and I hear this in what you're describing. You said we're not known for having ulterior motives. So let me ask you to double down on that part of Doubters Club. I'm assuming that Doubters Club doesn't have some ulterior motive. Like there's something about the club itself, the doubts themselves, the ability to, like, there's some kind of, whatever you want to call that. Maybe fellowship is too much of a Christian word or whatever, but there's something about that space that's already sacred enough. Give me just a tad bit there.
Yeah. So we actually say in Doubters Club, question faith, question certainty. And we have 5 ground rules. So like, we don't interrupt. We listen with an open mind. We value respect above being right. So we always go over those things. And what we're trying to do is to say, and I know it's not for everybody, but honestly, I desire spaces where there's no pressure to make people think like me, but I want to get to know stories and questions and doubts and objections by way of knowing the person. And so I get from all sides, Christians who would be like, oh, it's a Universalist club. And sure. I'm like, no, we're not a Universalist. We're just letting people share their beliefs and ask questions. And then I get from people who don't share the same faith as me, that they'd say like, okay, so is the motive to get us to go to church? And I say,
sure,
no, not at all. I don't care if you ever come to church.
Right.
That's why this doesn't take place in the church. So yeah, that's Doubters Club. I love it so much.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you have anything about family, hobbies, whatever is unique about you you'd throw in there before we get too deep into this?
I have an incredible wife that she just told me the other day. She said, we were talking about different speaking engagements coming up. She said, the evolution of your faith has been so fun to watch. And so that's my wife. That she's just faithful both on the journey and with the family. And then and I have two daughters, Piper and Brennan. And so they're just joys. They are the reason why it's hard to travel. Not because they need me home, but I think I need to be home with them. I might be a codependent parent. I don't know.
I like that. That's good.
Well, I do love the Doubters Club idea. As I've been looking at it, I'm thinking like, wow, there's probably some things that we can take away and apply to at least some of our BEMA discussion groups. Our groups are very much hands off as far as our involvement and our requirements and everything. And I don't necessarily think we're going to add a bunch of requirements, but we do have a lot of people who are like, well, how do I do this? How do I structure this? How do I get people in? And I think the Doubters Club could be a good resource for people to look at as they're trying to start a group and maybe take some things away from it that would work in their discussion. So I appreciate the work that you put into that.
Hey, any way I can be helpful, let me know. Seriously, I would love to help.
Awesome. Well, the main reason we're here today is to talk about this most recent work of yours, this book called Deconstruct Faith, Discover Jesus, How Questioning Your Religion Can Lead You to a Healthy and Holy God. And I think the title probably speaks quite a bit to that, but maybe give me a little bit more about the book, maybe the impetus to write it, what led you to it, and how what your process was in putting this all together.
Yeah, well, the book came out of a passion for interacting with people who don't think like me. And you can imagine in Doubters Club, it's filled with people that are deconstructing. And so originally, my first book called The Doubters Club, I had written, and I didn't plan on like, oh, let's do a second book right away. But I went down this road of interviewing a lot of people in the Doubters Club, celebrity pastors, people who've left the faith that would be that would be more famous, and just learning their stories. And as I learned, I realized, oh my goodness, the Christian circles that most of us are familiar with, primarily an evangelical circle, those Christian circles had some role to play in pushing or helping or even opening the door on the way out for people. And I just, the more I read the biographies of Jesus, specifically Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, I realized like, no, Jesus was a deconstructionist. And so all of that combined, I don't know if it was angst, if it was joy, or a mix of both, but all that combined is like when I reached out to my publisher and said, hey, I think I'd like to write a book on this topic.
And obviously this book shares, like, it has such a common affinity with my own and your heart and my heart. And I'm getting as we spend more and more time, even just on the Zoom call, like, I feel like there's a lot of things that you and I would just share as people and personality. But one of the things that I've been talking about on my book tour all the time, like there's always a spot that I hit where I just talk about how doubts are so important, that doubts are not the sign of a lack or an anemic faith, but they're the sign of a vibrant faith. But we haven't been taught to frame it that way. So I just love this common affinity with your book and just that theme of deconstruction, which we'll talk about more before we're done. But then even just going, like, taking a step back even to even think about this, your heart and your passion for the Doubters Club. And Brent asked you kind of like where the book came out of. I want to step back even one step further and say this passion of yours, this this heart of yours for doubts in that space. Like there's an abstract, like there's a logical reason why that makes sense. But if I could ask you, like, personally, what is the thing that personally mattered to you that made this important? Because there's a lot of things that make sense. Like we could do a lot of stuff. We could talk about a lot of things, but what makes this resonate with you on a personal level? What makes it so important to you beyond just the reason why it's important, but why does this for Preston, like this is the thing that invigorates you and you give your life to?
Well, thanks for asking. I mean, if it wasn't wrapped up in my story, I probably wouldn't choose this lane.
Yeah.
My story. It is my story, Marty. I went to a Bible college and walked away from faith in Bible college. And so I had people during that journey that they were well-intentioned people. They gave me really bad advice. I mean, listen to more worship music. I even got the advice, sleep on the Word of God, like in some sort of osmosis, it would get in my mind. And maybe it's because I slept on like NIV and not ESV. I don't know why it didn't work.
No.
But honestly, they gave advice that was just so outlandish. And there is one individual, a lot of people at play, one individual who told me, he said, I don't care where you land as long as you're honest. And he just assumed I had integrity and that I wanted to be honest. He didn't push me away. I was invited in his office on a regular basis. He ended up doing my wife and I's wedding. I mean, I believe in a Jesus-looking God because of this person.
Yeah.
My family had a role to play too, but I'm saying in that season, that was a critical season.
Yeah.
And when he did that, I think that set the trajectory for how I believe the only way I know how to be Christian and the only way I know how to do that is to ask questions. And I used to look at the Bible as a crisis intervention book with all the answers. And that just didn't work for me. This certainty-seeking faith crumbled and it caused a disaster in my life. And now I look at the Bible and it's a book of questions. And I'm like, wow, I can relate to this. And I wonder if anyone else could. And oh yeah, God does interact with people like this. And so it is a highly personal lane for me. And I sometimes worry because I'm like, I don't think, like I said, I don't think there's another way that I could follow Jesus with honesty and authenticity. And so the reason I say I worry is this is not a lucrative lane.
Right.
This is just, it's hey, we all doubt, we all ask questions. And, but I wouldn't have it any other way.
I love that as you tell that story about this individual that meant so much to you. Like you use the phrase something along the line of he trusted I had integrity. He trusted that. Like, it's so interesting that in our typical Christian paradigm, we think, oh, well, we're saved. We have the best of intentions. Our intentions are kind of above reproach. Their intentions are just so messed up, jacked up. Unbelievers, this. Like, I'm always trying to tell people, like, just because we may even categorize them as lost doesn't mean they're stupid. Like, doesn't mean they lack intelligence. It doesn't mean that, can't we just trust in their humanity enough to believe that their humanity alone is enough, their image of godness is enough to trust that they want the right stuff. They're leaning into the right things. Like, trust the process. Mm-hmm. Don't trust that the entire process, let alone the entire person, is broken. Like, trust that we're all share enough of this humanity. I love just that aspect of the Doubters Club, bringing these things together, because that space alone is sacred enough. Because we're all sharing at least the human experience, at least the human journey, which is far more tied to faith. Maybe not in a creedal sense, but in just a shared humanity sense. And I love that this person in your life trusted you with that, like knew that, I'm assuming trusted that God was already at work. Like it blew up the categories. And I love that so much.
Well, and that's why it is so personal is, again, I will always remember what he said. I don't care where you land as long as you're honest.
Oh, yeah.
And no question was off limits. And here's actually the piece that we don't talk about in churches. I think we're at a place now culturally where we'll say questions are welcome. But differing answers aren't welcome. And I think that for my journey towards the kingdom, I've had differing answers along the way. I mean, my faith has evolved, and intuition, experiences, imagination, all of that has come in, where before I felt like those three things were told to be left out. And it was about, you are as faithful as you are psychologically certain.
Yeah.
And when I experienced real life, I'm like, oh, I'm certain of very little.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was very meaningful.
And it sounds like you've taken that experience and turned it around and offered that space to so many other people. One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book is all the interviews that you had throughout. And I was curious, like, were all of these interviews conducted specifically for the book? Because I kind of get the impression that you just love to give people this space anyway. And maybe some of these were beforehand, and you said, oh, maybe I could actually share this story in a way that would be helpful for people. Like, what was the process of going through all of these interviews?
Yeah, there were some interviews where I reached out to people or people's publicists or whatever and just said, hey, I'm working on a project. Because at the time, I didn't know where I would land. I knew kind of what I was seeing, again, in the Jesus story in my own life, but that doesn't, just because I see a certain thing a certain way doesn't mean it's always right. So I would submit that, like, hey, I would like to do an interview, and it was set up as such. Other things were just stories of people that I'm doing life with, like I said, with people in the Doubters Club or in my community or in my neighborhood, and just seeing this common theme of people are deconstructing faith. And, we use that word intentionally, not religion. They're deconstructing faith, which is a highly personal part of our being. And in doing that, they're discovering something. And my hope would be they discover Jesus. And a lot of times, Jesus, like, they would be surprised to find Jesus did this same thing when he was walking amongst us. And so that was kind of the deal. Is like, some were intentional, some were unintentional. And the further along I got, I'm like, I need a voice that has gone through this, and I need to hear their story too.
Yeah, there's certainly an authenticity and openness to your approach that was really moving to me. And I think something that I will hopefully learn from and apply to my own conversations. I was also really, like, your interview with Joshua Harris hit me particularly strongly, because I think by the time the headlines about him scrolled by, like, oh, Joshua Harris has renounced his faith, it's like, at that point, I'm like, oh, another one. And so your interview with him said, okay, there's something there. There's something of value to his experience. There's humanity in him, and just approaching, like, I think there's just so many people, and obviously every one of us can't, go through that process with every other person. Like, you just can't take the burden of the whole world on yourself. But to not immediately write people off when they have questions, and to approach them and see what we can learn from them and see how we can walk alongside them was very inspiring.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I'll tell you a funny story that I haven't said this, but in a few small circles. The day I interviewed him, I had quite a few interviews lined up. Like, I remember waking up and being like, okay, I'm going to have, I don't know why I didn't think it would be like too much, but I need my coffee, and we're going to have interview after interview. And you're at that point on a book deadline, for the manuscript. And as I was interviewing him, it was so emotional for me. I walked out of my office in tears and told my wife, I said, hey, any of us can have that same story. And I had to cancel all my other interviews. I rescheduled them. I honestly didn't have the capacity to go through another story. And so I just wrote about that interview privately and what that meant. And hopefully that showed up in the pages.
Yeah, absolutely it did. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk about this word that we've not been afraid to use in this episode, and we try to talk about it on the podcast too, but super aware of this word, deconstruction. Obviously, it's in your title, and it's such a hot topic. I mean, in faith circles and outside faith circles, but especially online. Like, I mean, these days there's just so many emotional responses to the word. It will always come up at my different stops on book tour and meet and greets, and you can feel the room go different directions when that word gets said. Like you can just feel the different, like this group's going that way, and this group's leaning in, and this group's getting angry. And what is your overall, just personally, how do you feel about this cultural moment? Like, not just the abstract concept of deconstruction, but this moment that we're in culturally, in faith circles and maybe faith adjacent or whatever you want to call that circles. Does it exhaust you? Are you rolling your eyes? Are you invigorated? Are you frustrated? Are you worried? Like, what's your experience? Is it a little bit of everything when it just comes to the deconstruction conversation today?
Well, I do. I experience people that, well, let me say it this way. The us versus them narrative is very strong around this word.
Sure.
And when people, here's kind of what I'm sensing in culture as I'm traveling and speaking on it. When people aren't personally invested in the lives of those who are deconstructing, or they haven't hit a wall in their own faith, then they tend to write it off. When people like parents, let's say they're parents of now ex-evangelical kids, and they've heard that word from their kids, but they've never heard it in a church setting. It allows them to be like, wait, what is this thing? And so I think the moment we're in is revealing, do you have personal relationship with people who don't think, look, or act like you?
Yeah.
And I think the word deconstruct will quickly reveal that. And because it sounds like, if you don't know anything about it, if you're not invested in it, it sounds like the word destruct.
Sure.
And it sounds like deconvert, right? There's similar just in the actual word itself. And so that's why in the book, I have a chapter, deconstruction versus deconversion. And these things are not at all the same thing. And it is disorienting when you say that in a church setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And I did appreciate that part of the book. The other part I appreciate about the book, and I've told you this online in our different messaging back and forth, but my favorite part of the book is this parallel you make to the movie Encanto. I loved that parallel. I now can't watch the movie without thinking about it. So I have this thing that I do when I travel. I don't know why I keep doing this, but obviously I'm on all these airplanes and I watch these movies that are in the seat backs. And I always choose these. I think, this will be a safe movie I don't have to pay attention to. And I keep picking like these favorites of mine, like Inside Out. And then I just like sit there and just weep openly on the airplane.
Yes.
And I can't stop. And now I'm like, Encanto. Oh, I love Preston's book. Oh, I want to rewatch that movie. And I'm on the airplane now, just like considering the church community and those struggling and doubting and deconstruction. And I'm like just a hot mess on the airplane now for like every movie that I plug in there. But can you just talk about that parallel? Give us the brief, like, explanation of what you do when you parallel those, because I found it. I mean, it's fun and I laugh. It was actually very helpful for me. Like, it's a very helpful connection that allowed me to consider what it is that we often do in faith circles. So talk to me about that.
Well, I'm glad it worked, Marty. I'm glad it had an impact, because sometimes my applications don't always make sense. The movie...
I should actually interrupt you, Preston. We have a spoiler horn that we blow here. So if anybody hasn't seen the movie, Brent, you should probably blow the spoiler horn here.
Oh, man. Yeah. Well, yeah, people should see it.
If you haven't seen it yet, I don't even know what to tell you. But all right, I digress. Go ahead, Preston.
The movie is about the Madrigal family, and most of the people, Peppa, Dolores, they have these superpowers. One of them speaks to animals, has a pet jaguar, all those things. And then there's that character Maribel, and she's just normal. She doesn't have a power, and she's not actually performing for any crowd. And that's really important. And so there's also a character, Bruno. And if you're listening to this and you haven't seen the movie, perhaps you've heard the song, We Don't Talk About Bruno. I think it's like number one hit for longer than Let It Go.
Yeah.
Praise God. Someone knocked Let It Go out of there. Okay. So, Bruno Bruno he gives like prophecies about the house, the Encanto. It's this magical house, and he gives prophecies. So he kind of gets exiled, and they don't talk about him because they didn't like the prophecies. And he gets exiled into the walls of the house. He loves the house deeply. He loves the family. His words, his prophecies, his insights were never to get people away from him. They were always to help fix the house. So Maribel, who doesn't have any special powers, he isn't distracted by power or anything, and she's just ordinary. She starts to notice the cracks in the house, in the walls, and in the foundation. She tries to bring it up. Abuela is saying, no, nothing's wrong, cover up. And she's like, we got to figure out how to fix the walls and the holes in the house. And she finds Bruno in the walls. And in fact, he's so in love with the family that he'll even have dinner with them on the other side of the wall. And I just picture it like communion, he's sitting at table and they're eating. If they knew he was that close, they would fortify it more. He's part of the family, but they don't like what he has to say. Well, Maribel finds him. The whole house ends up coming down. And he ends up rebuilding it. He's part of rebuilding it. He's brought into the house, but it does take some things to fall. And so in the book, I just talk about Jesus is hiding in the walls of the house. And there's the brothers and sisters who don't fit the family mold, and they're finding him because they can see the house is cracking, and the house is in fact cracking. And so that's the story of Encanto. I think that it's a great parable for where we're at.
I can't even follow up after that. I'll need to be collecting myself over here. So I'm going to let Brent ask the next question.
I think this reveals some of my own church baggage in that when I first saw like a pop culture reference, I kind of rolled my eyes a little bit like, oh, another thing that we're just going to spiritualize. But it is such a beautiful picture. And when you how do you untangle the cultural stuff that doesn't really apply? And because when you look at that scene, especially where you see him on one side of the wall with his own table by himself, the rest of the family on the other side, that is such a moving image. But then there's other things about the movie that there's jokes, there's other distractions. How do you whittle it down to something that is so powerful as an image and not, I mean, do you get a pushback from other people as oh, why are you bringing this secular work into what you're talking about? I don't know exactly what I'm asking here, but there was this resistance in me internally when I saw that reference. But then when I got through it, it's oh, that is such a powerful image of what's happening here.
I don't know. It's probably more of a curse than anything just watch the movie. We were at a movie recently, a Disney movie, and I leaned over to my wife and started saying oh my goodness, this is really, and she's like, hey, just watch it for the movie. And honestly, here's the deal. I think there's a filter in the work I'm doing right now with doubters, skeptics, spiritually wounded people. I think there's a filter I can't unsee. Okay, it's you can talk Toy Story and how Woody could have went home without Buzz, but Andy would have been heartbroken. And so he committed to this long life of being with Buzz, and they're both transformed. And then they both get to find Andy. And I remember watching that during COVID and being with my kids and being oh, God doesn't want us to go home without Buzz. So it's like a curse, right? It's this, you can't unsee certain things, but I think it's because that's my life right now.
So on the other hand, however, that's what art is supposed to do for us, right? So art's having these same conversations. That filter matters for you because that filter speaks to this moment that we're living in, the things that and so art's doing the same thing. It's just doing it. So I don't think that's this crazy far off curse either. I think sometimes we're just noticing, I don't notice it in art enough. And when somebody just shows me well, just look at what they're doing here. Just look at what's going on. And I'm oh my gosh. And then I can't unsee it. And not to say that that's what Encanto was trying to do, was make a movie about deconstruction, but just that angsty because it's beyond, it isn't just in our faith circles. It's not just the church that's doing this. It's all kinds of systems in our world. It's the general, and this has always been true of every new generation struggling to figure out how to fly and to build a new world that stands on the shoulders of the one that came before them. And so these are moments that I think they're just really helpful connections that bridge the gap for so many people, because some people don't want to listen to an hour-long episode about the Jewish context of the Gospels. But man, show me in Canto deconstructing faith, and I'm in it to win it. So I love the context there. It's great.
Preston, do you speak a lot at your church? Are you a preaching pastor, or what is the role in your church, and how does this work fit into what you do in your local community?
Well, I've got to say, I'm very thankful that my local faith community allows me to be a pastor, to write about deconstruction, to encourage deconstruction. There's a lot, there's a lot of churches that would be like, and that's your exit strategy, right? My role when I'm not traveling and speaking and doing the things that go along with writing a book is I'm the spiritual formation. I'm the spiritual formation director for all of our campuses. And so this idea of discipleship starts way I'll use a pretty universal word, way pre-conversion. That how can we help people be formed in all the stages of their spirituality? Deconstruction is part of that journey. And I think that it's all throughout the scriptures. I think it's all throughout history. It's kind of our journey inward. And so my work works together with that. And then obviously what I do with Doubters Club is I am interested in how people are being formed, whether they're being formed like me. I don't want that, but I think that Jesus has a lot to say with how people are being formed in the world. So it seems to go hand in hand. I do speak quite a bit at the church as well. And I try not to always speak on the same topic, but I am drawn to this topic.
So speaking of all those other things that you do, are there any other things that you're working on? Things that we've talked about, the Doubters Club, we talked about this most recent book. Do you have other books? Do you have an upcoming book? Do you have anything else that you're working on that you are excited about? Might not even be something that maybe it's somebody else's work, but is there anything that you're just like, the world needs to know about this thing that's coming or this thing that is happening? What last little bits could you give us here before we're all done today?
Yeah, well, I actually just finished like today, maybe an hour before we got on this podcast. I just finished recording for the first time all the training sessions for the Doubters Club. And I'm super excited to release that content into the world, that people can just get that and they can live it as a lifestyle. They can launch Doubters Clubs in their own communities. So I'm actually going to have the team put it on the website, thedoubtersclub.com/BEMA, and then we'll have all the resources there. So if you're listening to this, you can go to that and the resources will be there. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited about what we're seeing with the book. We're having a lot of parents write in of saying, hey, we kind of screwed this up. When they were deconstructing, we said some things and did some things that we got to go back and apologize. What can we do? So a friend of mine and I were starting a cohort for evangelical parents who are trying to reconnect with their ex-evangelical children. And we're working with, we'll probably start that in January, February timeframe. But we're going to keep those going. And so anything that's going to continue to equip people, I know the church, we're like evangelism, but honestly, I think there's a case to be made that reconciliation is talked about more than evangelism. And so stepping into that space and in families is what I'm really, really pumped for.
I really like that. I was saying recently, maybe you and I should talk some more. I was saying recently at a big event I was doing, I feel like the age that the church is being called into is going to be age of confession and forgiveness. Like confession and seeking forgiveness. I don't think it's going to be like this age of, we're running the show and we have all the answers that you're looking for. We've done that really poorly for a really long time. And I think it was never really our show anyway. It's always been God's show. Like God's the one redeeming. God's the one drawing all men and women to himself. God's the one, it's always God's work. We're partners. We're hired hands. We're along for the ride. And when you said that, I was just like, woo! I have been feeling very, very similar things, and doesn't mean I'm a prophet or I'm right, but I really like that. So that's very cool.
Well, Marty, we can do a lot together. So
we should whiteboard something out.
Is the start of it.
Yeah, we should whiteboard something in Missouri. We'll have to get together.
Sounds great. I would love it.
I actually saw, I was traveling and visited a couple of BEMA groups in my hometown, Wichita, Kansas, and we had probably 15 people there. And about halfway through, we ended up sitting down in this big circle, and it was beautiful because I basically didn't talk. And the entire room bounced around just sharing experiences. And there were two sets of mother and daughters there, and both of them sharing like their faith journey and their experiences from childhood. And then the mothers also like being a part of that process and like seeing those moments of, oh, I wish I had done something different.
Mm-hmm.
But then me seeing like, oh, they're seeing that pain. They're seeing that hurt. They like, maybe they feel a little guilty about it, but they're also here. They're a part of the conversation. And so that idea of like keeping families together, going through this process together, growing together, learning together, I love that. And it's beautiful when it happens.
Well, I think what you observed, Marty, what you just said about repentance or confession, I mean, they go hand in hand, don't they? But I would say even confession, we have the church, historically, when we practice confession, we gain ground. I mean that in the purest sense of the word, not in a...
Right.
But we seem to gain even some moral ground of just going first. And there's a book called Conversational Intelligence, talks about cognitive mirroring. Someone has to go first in any relationship. And in the church's relationship with culture, the church should confess first. In fact, I don't even think we should ask culture to confess.
No,
I think that there's something about the household that is so fractured that if the church doesn't go first, they will unintentionally create deeper divides between parents and kids.
Well, and we're unintentionally going to lose ourselves. Like it becomes about
exactly.
Like this is on some level, this is about our own salvation. I don't mean that in some soteriological, like getting to heaven. I just mean where, like you said, moral. You used some phrase a moment ago, and it's about and like our own. Yeah, it's about our own salvation. Like there's still stuff that we're working through. And the danger of not working through this is that we are an unsaved, distorted, broken mess at the feet of the altar of efficiency, of a mission that we don't even understand. And even if we understood it, we wouldn't be fit to be on it in the first place.
You're right.
Anyway, this has turned into a different episode all of a sudden. I like it.
Well, hey, I mean, the house is cracking. And I would say this. I would say, here's what's so interesting about deconstruction, though. Deconstruction, historically, and even in this cultural moment, happens from the inside out. We're not talking about people trying to destroy the faith.
Oh, goodness, yeah.
So we're talking about minds that are looking towards this giant mountain of religion, church, God, whatever, and they're trying to figure out, like, in the book, I use the Mount Rushmore illustration. They're trying to figure out what's the image in the mountain. Yeah. And if it's anything outside of a Jesus-looking God, we should not act surprised if more deconversions happen, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
I appreciate the work you're doing, because I remember when I first learned about the BEMA podcast, it was like other podcasts, you hear about it and people are like, you should listen to this, you should listen to it. And then I had my deconstructing friends being like, hey, you should really listen to this. And I'm like, wait, somehow this podcast has gotten, they're like bridging the gap between the church and the unchurched. So well done.
Well, that is that's one of my passions. And if somebody were to ask me the same question I asked you, I'm not sure I'm even self-aware enough to know Like it's connected to my story. But yeah, I really value, we always present two options, and those are two valid options, I suppose, but there are more options. There are more options to wrestle and to ask questions and to grow. And this conversation doesn't just have to be, there aren't just two jerseys. You're either wearing this jersey or that jersey. Like there are way more ways to be. And I do think, you're talking about the walls are cracking. I do think people love the house more than we give them credit for. I think people love the house. Now it feels like I'm getting silly with the metaphor, but I do think we always think people are trying to attack this thing. And I don't think people are. I think people are actually mesmerized by it. They love it. And by that, I mean Jesus, the Christ, this thing but then they look at what's in the frame, and they're like, but it's bigger than that. It's better than that. And this is how we get there. So I do love it. And I do love that we're all doing our parts and it comes together.
Yeah. Well, the questions are going to be part of it. I recently was talking to someone, and they told me, they said, the scriptures say, and this is someone that's like, I wouldn't say they're a Jesus follower, but they're very curious. They said, scripture says that the Christ is the revelation of the mystery of God, not that the Christ is the mystery of God solved. And they're like, so how do Christians not ask questions? Like,
right.
The embodiment of God is a mystery.
Yep.
And I just remember thinking, that is the only way some people know how to be Christian, and it might be the best way.
Yep, absolutely. All right, Brent, you better take us home. If not, we could be at this for like 2 or 3 more hours if this starts to keep going.
Which sounds delightful. I think these extended conversations can happen in, BEMA discussion groups or Doubters Club groups or whatever. Definitely needs to be in community with people.
Yes.
So Preston, we've got the doubtersclub.com/BEMA that we're going to put in the show notes. We've got links to your books as well, and maybe 1 or 2 other things that we mentioned along the way. Anything else people should know about as far as how they might get connected to you?
They can follow me on Instagram. It's PT Ulmer. Last name's ULMER. They can find me on Facebook. I wish I was better with TikTok and stuff, but or they can just email me, Preston@thedoubtersclub.com.
Okay.
And would love to, any way we can help people or resource them, get them plugged into cohorts. We'd love to.
Well, we hope people get connected. All of those links will be in the show notes at BEMAdiscipleship.com. We've also got our groups, events, everything else that's coming up there. Our contact page is there. Everything you need is on the website. So go there, get connected one way or the other. And thanks for joining us, Preston, today. It's been a pleasure.
Well, listen, it's been awesome, and I appreciate everything y'all are doing. Keep it up.
And thank you to all the listeners for joining us on the BEMA Podcast. We'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Riff. We'll have a brand new episode every week, wherever you find podcasts.